Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our second session in our year-long series focused on the employee experience. Today's session will be led by Carrie Rosa, our Director of Implementation and Technical Services. Carrie has spent literally years studying what makes a successful employee experience program. And so today she will share with us the critical focus areas that create a successful outcome for companies, leaders, and employees. So take it away, Carrie.
Thanks, Brett. So thank you for joining our February webinar, everyone. I have to give a special shout out to a couple of very special attendees on today's webinar. Mom and Dad, also known as Rex and Becky Richter. If you can hear me, thank you for showing up every single day for your kids and family, even your adult children as they host a global webinar. What could be better? Also, I have to give a shout out to my husband, James, who took an extra long lunch break today, too, to be able to log on and listen. I think I might start holding weekly webinars at home to assign chores since this is how I get everyone's attention. So on a serious note, as we get started here, I just want to remind everybody that you have been put on mute. And we are recording this session so that it can be accessible and sent to all attendees after today's call. And lastly, if you do have a question, please go ahead and feel free to type that in the chat. We're going to wait just a minute. I think we need to get our video screen shared. And then we'll have our PowerPoint up and running, and then we'll go. Give us just a minute. Perfect. And then we can go to the next slide.
I have one job and I'm ruining it already.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so like you may have already seen in our promo video, today's session is going to be centered on tips and tricks for a successful execution of an engagement program. We are going to talk about everything from start to finish. So let's dive in. Nothing to it but to do it, right? All right, so we're going to talk through 6 milestones today. And while the preparation for these milestone moments may happen concurrently when you're actually implementing your program, we're going to talk through them in the most orderly and sequential way as possible. We believe if you can focus your prioritization in the same manner that we talk through these today, that alone will help you to ensure you're administering a successful program. So let's start with senior leadership buy-in. This may seem like a small component, and while for some it may be easy to obtain, its impact is actually really vast. One of the most common methods of gaining buy-in from senior leaders is through what we call stakeholder interviews. This is an opportunity for principal officers in your organization to lend their voices so that the survey is designed to meet the very specific and collective needs of the organization. So I want to share with you my own story of the importance of this milestone, because we at WSA believe so deeply in our best practices that we don't just talk the talk, we actually walk the walk. So each January, we run our own internal engagement survey. And this means that we also start with gaining senior leadership buy-in through stakeholder interviews. So I had the opportunity to participate in our own stakeholder interview earlier this year. And it really helped me to not only buy into the just the survey engagement program itself, but it felt really good to be able to feel like I was informing item design, which is essential in planning, but also to help create a sense of ownership. And like I mentioned, the buy-in. And that buy-in has such a significant impact on actual participation results because senior leaders are more inclined to encourage participation in something that they truly believe in. After the results come in, you never want to hear a leader say, like, why did we have to do that? So helping them feel a part of the design ensures a greater investment and action after the survey. And as we've mentioned, their buy-in impacts so many other milestones. You'll notice at the bottom of this slide, and this will be consistent on each of the slides that we talk through, we're going to kind of outline a practice and a pitfall. So when we are thinking about senior leadership buy-in, we want to practice collecting feedback from key leaders to ensure their ownership and buy-in and action. We want to avoid, or the pitfall is when senior leaders are not afforded a chance to weigh in up front, it increases the risk of them discounting the results or failing to take accountability for the feedback received. Next up is item design. We actually have a team at WSA that is dedicated to studying and interpreting the data we've collected. We call this our WSA data team. And this data is used to create benchmarks, as well as a library of focused actions validated to drive results. Those benchmarks are, another word for those would just be comparative marks, or something to compare to. Using the input from the stakeholder interviews of senior leaders, WSA can make sure that you're asking the right questions and in the right way to produce results. And we understand that like every organization is unique. So for that reason, it's not uncommon for companies to come to WSA with their own item set already developed. And while the intentions are great, this sometimes limits their ability to use that comparative data or those benchmarks. Additionally, without the expertise behind the design of these questions, we often see questions that are quote unquote double-barreled, meaning they ask two things in one question, which dilutes response data and makes positive results from actions unpredictable. As an example, consider the clarity between these two statements. First, I am proud of our products and service versus I am proud of the products we produce. Response data from the latter option is focused on the products versus the first statement, which was double-barreled on both products and service. Additionally, you may want to avoid statements that are like not actionable. So an example of that I would give is, I am happy at work. That statement may be really interesting, but you can't go up to an employee and command them to be happy by saying, hey, be happy. So it's not an actionable statement. So ensuring that you're asking the right questions and in the right manner is also critical when we consider our first topic of senior leadership buy-in. Using those stakeholder interviews to mold the survey to the uniqueness of the organization helps validate their buy-in while using customized known content from our database. Remember, an employee survey is not like a test score, meaning we don't want items that skew too positively or too negatively, but rather items that produce a nice distribution of results. And the other thing I like to add here is that there is not the only wrong answer in a survey is a dishonest answer. What we're looking for is not high versus low. We're looking for honest response data because honest response data is actionable. This is sometimes counterintuitive for managers. Generally, the first question they have when the survey closes is, what are the scores? And the second question is, are those scores any good? And so again, kind of reiterating that using those items that have benchmarks to put the results into context is super critical. So what do we want to practice and what do we want to avoid? While custom items can sometimes be insightful for commonly measured topics, we do want to make sure to take time to collect proven, validated items with benchmarks. And as a pitfall, avoid unintended criticism from employees or managers with complaints that they didn't understand how to interpret the question, or maybe who the referent was on the feedback they were providing, as this could actually impact future participation. As a project manager, I've always held a soft spot for healthcare organizations. I've supported healthcare organizations all over North America. And one of my very first hospitals was a small system with only 5 hospitals in a lower income city area. And they had limited resources. But our project lead was passionate and committed. And I'm also going to add here that I was a little bit intimidated by her at first because she was so focused and driven. Coming full circle, I ended up having such a great, respectful relationship with her because she managed every aspect of the project implementation flawlessly. Except for one, she was a little nervous and probably a little bit intimidated in the same way I felt a little intimidated at the beginning. She was intimidated to communicate with her senior leaders. So she seemed to worry that maybe they were too busy or had more important things to do than worry about her engagement program. And although she executed an extensive communication plan perfectly, when the survey launched and the caregivers were asked asked their leaders directly about the purpose of the survey, many of those leaders said they weren't aware of it because the leadership wasn't supporting the program or was unaware of it, the project actually really struggled. And this is tying into this bullet point here of a communication plan. So a typical survey is administered for approximately 2 weeks, give or take. However, after extending her survey to 4 weeks, they were still unable to achieve the minimum 55% response rate, which is what we recommend as the minimum rate needed to accurately measure the overall sentiment of an organization. Their lack of a communication strategy left them scrambling to get responses because there was not enough awareness and promotion of the program. They were actually inundating people's inboxes with email reminders up to 3 times a day for almost 6 weeks before they finally closed the survey. And this was so hard for me to watch because our team member, she was exhausted. Those were hard-fought responses, and they were exhausted from their efforts before they even entered the real work of being able to take action. And this was all because there were not clear expectations communicated and set in advance. So as a practice, start communicating your survey a minimum of 6 weeks prior to the launch. And every time you communicate about it, provide a little bit more detail and more specifics around it. Also, don't rely on email alone. Leverage all channels that you have at your disposal, whether it's an all teams meeting, a QR code on a poster, or text dissemination, whatever you have at your disposal, use. And then a pitfall is simply knowing a survey is coming is not enough. If employees don't really understand the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, the how, they will be less likely to respond, and they will also be more likely to voice concerns over the confidentiality of the survey too. All right, data file. This is where I get to use the line, talk nerdy to me. It's another milestone that can be labor intensive in preparing for your survey, but it's actually one of my favorite parts of the survey preparation. It's tricky because we're actually trying to catch a moving target when we prepare that data file. It's hard. I always try to explain to my clients that in the same way our survey is happening at a point in time, so is our data file. So I'm not the same age today as I'm going to be tomorrow or as I was yesterday, nor is my tenure the same. Everything changes every day. And so I often equate it to a family photo on a holiday card. That family photo represents a snapshot in time of what your family looked like on that day. So while there are changes every day, what's most important is that we're capturing data that's meaningful and action-based. For example, just because you have it in your database doesn't mean it's valuable for survey analysis. If you can't justify action based on the data, don't include it in your data file. Too much information can cause analysis paralysis by focusing on what's interesting and not what's important and or actionable. Most often I see clients who make this aspect of their program more complicated and cumbersome than it really needs to be. Additionally, one of the most robust things about the Qualtrics system in particular is its ability to apply data retroactively. So if after your survey is closed, you all of a sudden realize that there is an important attribute that you regrettably missed to collect, you can add that attribute back in later and reanalyze the data. So know that there's some grace in this process as well. So as a practice, keep it simple. Just because you can doesn't mean you always should. And when considering metadata, demographic data, attribute data, whatever you want to call it, to include, ask yourself, what do I really need to learn from this survey? And as a pitfall, the most common support request we get by far is troubleshooting issues associated with org files and hierarchies. So in addition to keeping it simple, don't make the mistake of rushing the process either. It's a really kind of tricky balance, but make sure you do leave plenty of time in your timeline for review and refinement of the data file. Make sure that multiple sets of eyes review the data before anything is loaded, and keep in mind that this is by far one of the most complicated parts of the project. I mentioned earlier an example of a healthcare organization who really struggled in their communication plan. But now I want to share about a different healthcare organization whose communication plan helped drive their participation. This organization is one of the most highly regarded children's hospitals in Canada, and they faced one of the most challenging scenarios imaginable, which was collecting feedback from their caregivers during the absolute height of the COVID pandemic in March of 2020. For most healthcare workers, this was the most stressful, scary, and exhausting time of their career, and probably it always will be reflected on that way. And while other healthcare systems chose to stop collecting feedback altogether because their people were too busy, this client actually doubled down and stressed more than ever is now was the time that they wanted to know how to help their employees. So what they did was they executed a super well coordinated effort to ensure every caregiver heard from someone that they trusted personally about the survey and its purpose. And amazingly, in spite of being on the front lines of the pandemic, the organization's response rate reached an all-time high. And this was truly a product of teamwork and effective communication. Their teamwork put together a plan that was accessible. This means using all forms of distribution options like text, email, and QR. Also, reminders are really important. We all know that things can get lost or buried in our inboxes or text threads. So maintaining your enthusiasm for participation from start to finish is also super important. But most importantly, as soon as you can after the survey is closed, thank employees for their honest and open feedback. There's no need to say anymore until you have a plan of action for your specific results. Just be sure to acknowledge your appreciation for them taking the time to provide their feedback. So practice. You can make a response rate dashboard available to leaders, HR business partners, job family directors, starting the moment the survey opens. So utilize that option and then monitor it and leverage support at all levels to deliver those reminders, especially in pockets where response rates are maybe a little bit lower. And a pitfall, even for companies who are smaller in size, taking on participation on your own is like fighting a losing battle. Remember, hearing about the survey from only one voice can kind of be like that riddle: if a tree falls in the middle of the woods and nobody hears it, did it make any noise? And I don't really know if that's how that riddle goes, but that's what that makes me think of when we think about just a person standing alone trying to get their voice out there. So use all your members of your team and their collective voices. This brings us all to the take action part. So when all these components come together, you can have confidence that your survey results are an accurate representation of your organization, which will really help you to determine where to focus your action. Taking action is the single most critical aspect of any engagement listening program. In a nutshell, why ask the questions if you're not going to listen to the answers? An engagement survey should not be rhetorical. The absolute worst thing you can do is nothing. So be ready to take action. Set goals that align to our SMART guidelines, such as being specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound. This ties back to everything we've spoken about to this point. Then be sure to communicate to your organization and individual teams what those plans are. And lastly, commit to the plan. So as a practice, understand the results, share the results, act on the results, and commit to your action. And include everybody from all levels of senior leadership, business unit leaders, and frontline leaders. All should be involved in that understand, share, act, and commit process. And a pitfall. One of the most powerful items we recommend on every survey is the statement, "I believe positive change will occur as a result of this survey." And it's like clockwork. When people see and feel action from their feedback, engagement and participation goes up. When they don't, the opposite happens. So don't make the mistake of deploying surveys too often or faster than leaders are able to demonstrate to their employees that their voices have been heard and acted upon. The time is now, yay. So as we recap the things we've talked about today, remember the 6 points. Without senior leadership buy-in and support of the initiative, taking action will feel like you're sneaking out of the house past curfew. If you haven't asked the right questions and in the right way, you might not even be able to take action. You could find yourself feeling hamstrung. And I just cracked back up with the sneaking out past curfew. Your communication plan can impact both your participation and overall results. A clean, clear, and succinct data file will help you determine specific areas of opportunity for driving action. Remember, too much data to analyze can create analysis paralysis and a tendency to want to focus on what's interesting instead of what's important. And lastly, without reaching a participation rate that validates an accurate representation of your employee base, any action could be misguided. So as you consider the coordination efforts needed for your engagement program, know that the time to listen is now. Waiting for the quote unquote right moment is futile. There will never be a perfect moment. We see engagement programs running year round. And even as I mentioned during COVID, when it could have been arguably one of the most difficult times to run a program. So the question is, why wait? Unlock the doors with the keys to driving engagement. We are here to help you all. Thanks for joining. Were there any questions in the chat?
Yes, thank you, K-Rod. If you have any questions, please use the chat, or will we be unmuting, or should we use the chat? We'll use the chat. And just while we're giving people a few moments to do that, please join us next month. Dr. James Longabaugh will be reviewing the very first look at our refreshed database of research. It's called our State of the Workforce. And there's some really interesting trends that are hot off the presses. And so that'll be this time next month. So we really look forward to seeing you there. And with that, I don't see any questions in the chat. We'll let everyone get back to their day. Thanks so much for joining, everybody. Thank you, Carrie. And thank you, Rex and Becky and James for joining as well.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, all.